Music theory with OneNote. Scale degree chords versus modal chords, this time adding another layer of meaning, a layer of meaning as rich as the foundational layer which it is put upon, not just icing on the cake for goodness sake, although it could look like that to the untrained, naive mind because it is the color system. So get ready and some coffee because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. Not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS Presentation 2364, OneNote, Scale Degree Chords versus Modal Chords with Color, list of presentations. They're on the right, which we plan on adding plenty more to shortly. Also noting in this OneNote presentation, we'll spend our time on music theory, but have a similarly named and numbered presentation where we build these tables in Excel, practicing music, Excel, and table visualization skills all at the same time. Quick overview of our objective here, that being to come up with a color system which is optimized for helping us understand music theory as well as create tools such as a colored fretboard to navigate the fretboard and to better understand more specifically this time chord constructions. So for example, if you were to ask a chatbot like a ChatGTP, would you please give me a list of chord constructions that are common to a 7-note collection such as the 7-note collection built around the C major? You might get a table that looks something like this. All of these chords then are chords that shouldn't land you in the ocean, meaning you can build them from at least one of the nodes in the 7-note collection and not have to grab a note that is outside of that 7-note collection. However, as we saw before, because it's not based on the nodes themselves, it's a little difficult to know exactly how this is going to be applying out. In other words, I'd rather see this by, if I have the 7 main notes, recognize those 7 main notes by, say, the Nashville number system, and then determine which of the chords I can build off of each of those 7 notes. That, in essence, is what the Nashville number system is doing. The normal chord system doesn't name the chords by the relative position, but rather by note, which doesn't tell you anything about the relative position. But the color helps us with this chord chart. So I'm going to show it first, then we'll go through the process, and then I'll go back in here and show it again. So for example, the major chords are the green ones. So you would expect that all of the major or Ionian node chords, in this case off of the C, would fit into this pattern. These are all green in that they're going to be matching the modal color that we've come up with, which is going to be, in essence, the yellow-green color. But if it's a 3-note chord, it's going to be lighter. 4-note chords are going to be a little darker, 5 a little darker, 6 a little darker, and 7 a little bit darker. Now, if I was to compare the other 2 major modes to the Ionian, they would include the Lydian. Now, so the Lydian, notice, doesn't have anything up top. That's a blue color. I don't see any blue colors for the 3, 4, and 5. Why? Because it has the same construction. It has been consumed by the major chords. They look the same. They have the same relative positions. But then you can see that by color, it breaks out here. So if I know that color are the ones built off of the Lydian mode, they're going to be Lydian chords. I can see that this is the point that they're going to break out. Why does that happen? Because the Lydian has an augmented 4th or 11th, which messes everything up from that point onward. And then the other one that's a major is the Mixolydian. Mixolydian is magenta color. When we build off of the Mixolydia, you can see we have this whole category for them, but the top one isn't there. Why? Because the top one is consumed by the major, and then the rest of them are broken out. What about the minors? Primarily located in our minor column, and then we could have some minor extensions. We would expect the minor column to be completely dominated by the Aeolian, which is the main minor, the minor scale, in a similar fashion as the major scale or Ionian dominated the entire major column. Not exactly what happens in the minor, however. The Aeolian is red, and we have all shades of red, except for this last one where we have the 13, in which case we need an extension extension for the minor. So that's going to be the pattern for the minor in our table. If we compare the other two minor modes to it, that being the Dorian and the Phrygian, starting with the Dorian, which is green, you can see I don't see any green except for this yellow green, but I don't see the Dorian green anywhere as I go from the 3, 4, 5, and 6 note chords. Then we see it pop up on the 7. It took the place of this item that the Aeolian had to have an extension for. That means that the Dorian is completely consumed by the same minor and has the same structure, except because it has that one interval difference on the 13, which is equivalent to the 6, then that's why this is here, because now it has room. So it's kind of funny, because if we did not have the layer of the Aeolian, the Dorian would actually dominate the whole minor category from a chord construction. It fits all in one column, whereas the Aeolian, which you would expect to fit here, doesn't and needs an extension with that 13. So then we can go to the other minor, which is the Phrygian. So the Phrygian, you can see, is going to be this blue. It's going to be the spring blue. You don't see it for the 3 and the 4 note chords because, once again, it's been dominated by the Aeolian. So it has the same structure as the Aeolian. Then you see it pop up here with the extensions because the Phrygian has the minor 2nd or the minor 9. So that messes everything up from that point onwards, which is a 5-note chord, a 6-note chord, and then the 7-note chord down here. So the color does not totally clear up this table, but it helps a little bit. By the way, the diminished is going to be here. So you have the diminished, which is a 3-note, and then everything up from there is going to be the half diminished built off of the Locrian node. So the color won't clear things up completely because our chord system is not optimal, but at least it clears things up a little bit. And what we want to do is, if we look at the fretboard and look at this one down here, which is breaking out each of the frets, the first side being the point, that point being either in note or in relative position or scale degree, the second side being distance, that being the intervals or modal distance, then thinking about our chords makes a lot more sense, because now I can look at the distance between each of these and measure from the perspective of each chord. So for example, here on the Ionian, here's an Ionian here, an Ionian here. It's a perfect first away, which is 0 notes away, 0 modal half steps away. If I look at the same collection of notes down here on this fretboard, it's now from the perspective of the Dorian. So the first side of each fret is the same, but the second side now has been changed to a different, to the perfect first tied to the Dorian. So these are tools that are actually quite effective in kind of understanding how the chord construction is working and measuring distance. So let's go back up top and then go through our color coding system bit by bit. So we have a color coding system for the points. The points are going to be the notes, or which is often more important, particularly in this presentation, that being the relative nodal positions. That's important here because we're going to give a color system to the chords based on the Nashville number system, which in essence we gave a color to. All right, so we have, let's just recap these. Red is A. We have A sharp or B flat is orange. Yellow is going to be a B. We've got C, which is note number 4, is going to be our yellow green. Now we're going to build our Ionian, like with the Nashville number system, is built off of the C to oftentimes. We're then going to give the same color system that way. So this is going to be yellow green, and that yellow green will apply to C, the note, but also apply to all Ionian if we think about it from the perspective of the nodal points for all 12 collections of 7 notes. The green is going to be note 5, which is C sharp or D flat, and then the note 6, D, is going to be spring green, and that's the Dorian note because we go a whole step up if we apply the formula from the C. So that one, again, is going to be our permanent position or our permanent Dorian color for all 12 sets of 7 notes. Cayenne is going to be note 7, D sharp or E flat, and then we've got note 8, which is E, is going to be sky blue or Phrygian, because now you can see the formula whole. So this is going to be then the Phrygian color from the perspective if we're looking at the points by basically Nashville number system in colors as opposed to by notes. The 9 is going to be an F, which is going to be blue. Once again, that's Lydian because the formula is whole, 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 half. So Lydian will be blue for all 12 color sets. And then 12 is F sharp or G flat, which is going to be violet. And then note 11 is G, which is magenta. And magenta is going to be mixolydian. So from a Nashville number color system, we're going to say that mixolydian will have an absolute color of magenta. G sharp or A flat, which is note 12, is going to be rose. And then A, as we flip around, we're going around the horn again, applying our formula, whole, whole, half, whole, whole, it's going to be red. So aeolian is going to be red from an absolute position. And then we're going to have the B completes our collection of 7 notes, and it's going to be yellow. So that means if we look at it by nodal point, we've got Ionian is going to be yellow-green, Dorian is going to be spring-green, Phrygian is going to be sky-blue, Lydian is blue, Mixolydian is magenta, and Aeolian is red, and Locrian is yellow. These are going to be our abbreviated letter names. This is our Nashville number system. Now these are going to be the permanent colors, which I'm also going to tie to the chords, remembering that if I use normal chord construction, I can't do this, right? Because the problem is the normal chords are named by note point, which doesn't tell me which collection of notes I'm in. But if we name them by relative position, then I can use an absolute color system to name the chords, which again is functionally a much better system to play within. It's going to be a lot easier to understand if instead of when we're playing, we name the relative position like the Nashville number system does, and as opposed to the note name, which also then permits us to do things like name the chord by a starting point and ending point, or starting point and distance, as well as give it a permanent system of color similar to the Nashville number system based on the same concept. So then if I look at, we can look at distances now. So distances, we have modal half steps. Modal half steps represent the distance between each of the notes within like the 7 Nashville number notes. So if we have there's only 7 distances then, or 6 distances plus the 0, 7 distances. So it's going to be shades of gray, 6 or 7 shades of gray. I'm not going to take into account octaves here. I'm just going to keep it fairly simple for the local distance, 6 to 7 shades of gray. All right, and then when we look at the color system for distance, we also have half step distance. So these distances between the notes are not necessarily in our baseline units of half steps. They're in collection of notes. You have to know where you start from to know the total distance. These are going to give us half step distances using a similar color, but we've rotated the color wheel 15 degrees. So we have a different set of 12 notes so that we can name everything by color. So if I don't go anywhere, we're going to call that flame. If I go 1 note up, I don't care if you call that a 1 note away minor second or a half step up, I'm going to call it amber. 2 notes up, I don't care if you call it 2 notes up or a whole step or 2 half steps or a 2 note away major second, it's chartreuse. 3 notes up is lime, 4 notes up is mint, 5 notes up is aqua, 6 notes up is electric sky, 7 notes up is azure, 8 notes up is grape, 8 is grape, 9 is fire or orchid, and 10 is fuchsia, and 11 is going to be, I'm going to call it punch. All right, so those are going to be our distance names. All right, so now let's think about our naming convention for each of the chords. Now, the best way to really think, like if you're functionally thinking, how am I going to write a song? What you want, this chord chart that we looked at over here isn't all that helpful to you because it's not telling you which chords I can build off of in the collection of notes. It's easier to start off saying, okay, I'm in essence in some collection of notes, such as the 7-note collection, I can build off the C major. I don't have to make the C the tonic or the Ionian the tonic. I can make any of them the tonic. but I want to know which chords are available to me that aren't in the ocean, that aren't grabbing something that's outside the key. Because if I grab something outside the key, I want to do it intentionally. Okay, so this chord chart doesn't really do that because, again, it's hard to know which nodes you're on. Now, you're almost always going to be building something, at least from the framework, of some collection, one of the 12 collections of 7 notes, with one of those notes being the tonic, right? So it'd be nicer to build the chords by saying, okay, what am I going to build off of each of those nodal points? The Ionian node, the Lydian node, the Dorian node, and so on and so forth. So if I'm on the Ionian node and I'm in the key of C, now I don't have to be in the key of C if I write everything in a relative position, which I'm advocating for here. But if you use normal convention, you can't. You have to call it basically a C major. So C major means we're going to be on the C note, and then we're going to go a major distance up to the last note in it, in essence, meaning the last note is going to be the 5th that we go up, or you can say it's a triad and we take every other note for the normal major. Now, what I would like to do is to say that we're going to call it just something without the C, but a relative point. So I can call it an Ionian C 2 modal half step, meaning the distance to the last note is 2 modal whole steps up, I should say. And that, though, means that the C is still redundant. I'd like to get rid of the C. I'd like to say, hey, look, we're in the collection of notes around the C major, and then just call it an Ionian 2 modal whole step chord. And that'll give me the point I'm on and 2 modal whole steps up, so that I can easily transpose this through all 12 collections of 7 notes. If you write that way, the transposing is easy. Okay, and then you could just call it a 3-note Ionian chord, meaning just take every other note. If the Ionian is the tonic, then I could capitalize the I and make it a capital I2, meaning the standard convention could be, I'm going to tell you, like with the Nashville number system, the collection of notes based on the Ionian node, the major, even if I'm playing with some other thing as the tonic, like the Dorian node, so that you have a convention so that you can easily find the correct crayon box that we are in. And then you can tell what the tonic is by capitalizing it, so that you don't have to say that. You could just show it within the song by saying the one with a capital is the tonic. So I think that's a useful tool. And we could say it's you can also name it by range. It's a 1-5 modal range chord, meaning you start on the 1 Nashville number system, take every other note till you get 3 of them, you get end off at the 5. So it's a 1-5 modal range chord, or you can call it then an IX modal range chord, which would be the Ionian to Mixolydian modal range chord. Now, from a color standpoint, we're building the color off of the Ionian node. The Ionian is yellow-green. So this yellow-green color, it looks like almost just a normal spreadsheet color, but it's actually the color of the chord, is what we can name it by. We could say this is the yellow-green chord. This is the light or grade 3, light grade 3 for a 3-note chord, yellow-green chord, right? And we could say, you know, the 1-5 modal range chord is the light or third shade of lightness yellow-green chord. Okay, so that's, and then over here we have then the distance. So the distance are the nodes now. So how do I build a C major or a 3-note Ionian chord? Well, it's a 1-3-5, or from a color standpoint, naming the nodal points, the Ionian is yellow-green, the Phrygian is sky blue, and the Mixolydian is magenta. So it's the yellow-green, sky blue, magenta chord, right? And then these up top are giving us the shades of gray for the half steps. Would be 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. That gets a little thrown off up here because the shades of gray aren't going up octaves. So that's going to be that idea. And so let's bring it down to the rest of them, then we'll go back. So what if we have a 4-note chord? Normally you'd have to name it by the note name, which in our case is going to be C. So we would have to say it's a C major 7. But the C doesn't tell me, once again, if it's an Ionian chord or a Lydian chord or a Mixolydian chord, really, or maybe it's not a Mixolydian chord because it has a major 7, but it's still kind of confusing. It would be better to remove the C and say it by node. So it would be a 4-note Ionian chord, meaning take every other note until you get 4 of them, or an Ionian C3, but the C would be redundant. I'd rather just call it an Ionian 3 modal whole step chord. Start on the Ionian, go 3 modal whole steps to get to the end point, and then take every other note on the way. We can name it by color though, by saying it's the yellow-green chord, right? It's the yellow-green chord for fourth shade of lightness, 4 shade of lightness, yellow-green chord, or right, and that's going to tell you that it's going to be an Ionian. It's building off of the Ionian because the Ionian is the yellow-green node. If we look at the nodal points, then it's going to be a 1, 3, 5, 7 from a Nashville number system, or an Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian. So that means the colors that we're going to be adding, if we just say it by color, the 4-note Ionian chord is yellow-green, sky blue, Mixolydian, Locrian. From a modal range standpoint, it's an Ionian Locrian chord, or the endpoints are yellow-green to yellow, right? An IN chord. So then we can say, well, what if we had a 5-note chord? Well, that's going to be 1 shade of green darker. So it's the 5 shade of darkness Ionian chord is what we could basically name it. If we named it conventionally, we'd have to name it by note, C major 9. But that's not specific to where we are on the fretboard in terms of, are we talking an Ionian or are we talking a Mixolydian or Lydian, possibly not a Mixolydian, but in any case, then I'd rather call it a 5-note Ionian chord, or an Ionian C4 modal half-step chord, or just an Ionian 4 chord. And if I did that, I'm giving it a color now based on the node, which is yellow-green. So the yellow-green, from a chord standpoint, is telling us it's an Ionian chord, and we're going to say it's 5 degrees of darkness, meaning it's a 5 note, it's a 5 shade, 5 yellow-green chord, right? Because it's got 5 notes in it. So then what are going to be, so that's going to add then to it this 2, and the 2 is the Dorian, which is spring green. So the modal range is a 2-1 modal range chord, or an ID modal range chord, which is, from a color system, the yellow-green to the spring green modal range chord. So it's a yellow-green, spring green modal range chord. All right, what if we add another one? So if we add the 11, it would be a C major 11, but I'd like to drop the C. So to drop the C, I can call it a 6-note Ionian, or an Ionian C5 modal whole step chord, but the C is redundant. I'd rather just call it an Ionian 5 modal whole step chord, which could be then the node color, which is yellow-green. So it's a yellow-green 6 shades of darkness, yellow-green 6 shade of darkness chord, which means the 6 stands for how many notes are going to be in it. Maybe we should do it by whole steps. 5 shades of darkness. I don't have my naming convention for the darkness perfect right now, but you get the idea. Play with it. So then I'm going to say it's going to be a 1-4 modal range chord. 1-4 modal range, or an IY modal range chord, meaning it's going to be going from the Ionian to the Lydian, which is a yellow-green blue modal range chord. And then if I had another one, then a 13, it would be a C major 13, but I'd like to drop the C and name it by the node, so it would be a 7-note Ionian chord, or an Ionian C6, but the C is redundant if I know the collection of notes, so an Ionian 6 modal whole step chord, which would be 6 times 2, or 12 modal half steps, which would be 13 scale degree, which would end us on a 6, which is Aeolian. So from a modal range, it would be an IA modal range chord, or from a color modal range system, it would be yellow, green, red modal range chord. Okay, so if we look at the note half steps, so what are the note half steps? Well, if I go 0 notes up, then if I go 0 modal whole half steps up, it would be 1 scale degree. Then we would have the 0 here, which would be flame, a distance of flame in notes. If I go 2 modal half steps up, it would be 3 scale degrees, which would be 4, and that's going to be the mint. If I go and let's look at it this way. Let's pull this out here. So distance-wise, now we're looking at distance numbers instead of point numbers. So if I go 4 up, that would be a 4-note away major third, which is mint, or it can be a 4-note away from the Ionian node to modal half steps, which again is mint, all because they're all going the same distance of 4. If I go 4 modal half steps up, it would be the 5th scale degree, which would be 7 notes up, which we can define as azur. So we can call that whatever you want to call it. We can call it a 7-note up perfect 5th. It's still azur because it's 7 notes up. We can call it a 7-note up from the Ionian node 4 modal half steps. It's still azur because it's 7 notes up. So if we say we go a 6 modal half steps, which is the 7th scale degree, it's going to be 11 notes up, which is punch. So punch is an 11-note away major 7, still going to call it punch, or you can call it 11-note away from the Ionian node 6 modal half steps, still going to call it punch. If we go 8 modal half steps up, 9 scale degree, then it's going to be 2 notes up, or 2 plus 12 notes up if we take that into consideration. But the local distance will be 2 notes away major 2nd, or major 9 if we take the octave into consideration, and or a 2-note up Ionian 8 modal half step. If we go 10 modal half steps up, 11 scale degree, it would be 5 notes up, which is aqua. So we can call that a 5-note away perfect 4th. You can say it's 4 plus 7, which would be 11, right? And there would be a 5-note away from the Ionian 10 modal half steps. If we go 9 modal half steps up, it would be 12 modal half steps up, 13th scale degree, then it would be 9 notes up, which is going to be orchid. So 9-note away major 6 will be orchid, or you can say it's going to be 9 plus 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 6 plus 7, which is 13, and then it's a 9-note away Ionian 12 modal half step. Now, if we look at the note names, we're looking at the key of C. So now these colors are based on the points, which are the key of C, which actually line up to the nodal points in this case, because we made the color system for the nodal points and the chords based off of the C major scale. But it'll be different when we get down here, because we're using 2 different color systems, one by point of note point, and 2, the one that I think is actually more useful oftentimes, by point of relative position, similar to the Nashville number system. So this is going to be the colors built based on the note points. Okay, so then what bucket are we in? These are the majors. They all land in the bucket of the major, just like we would expect. That's the cleanest one we're going to see. So let's say we go up to then the Lydian. So if we go up to the Lydian, now we're going to say that we start with an F major. Now the F major is not going to tell me where we are. Is it an Ionian? Is it a Lydian? Is it a Mixolydian? F, right? We don't really know by just the F. So I'd rather drop the F and say it by relative position, the Lydian, meaning call it a 3-note Lydian chord, for example, or a Lydian F 2 modal whole step. But the F is redundant if we know the collection of notes. I'd rather call it just a Lydian, which we're going to say is a Y 2 modal whole step chord. Now the Lydian has a blue as the color assigned to it. So we can also name it by, this is the blue chord, but it's got only 3 shades of darkness, right? 3 shades of darkness, blue chord for a 3-note Lydian chord, we can basically call it. Remembering that if you're telling someone that you're playing in Lydian, it'd be nice to tell them the collection of notes based on the major scale, meaning I could say, look, I have the collection of notes like the Nashville number system does based on the major scale of the C major, but the tonic is going to be the Lydian, which we can then indicate with the chord by having a capital Y when we express the chord, so that we can say that's going to be the tonic chord. Now you could say that we're playing in F Lydian without expressing that we're in the collection of notes around the C major. You can derive it using the Lydian formula, but it's a little bit not as nice kind of to do that, because then again, there's a whole bunch of different ways you're deriving the same 12 crayon boxes, right? They're all the same 12 crayon boxes. It would be nice if we told them one way to get there, and then we, as a convention, right, and then we tell you which one is the tonic. But whatever, in any case, we're going to call this a 461 modal points, which is Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian, which means we can call this then a YI modal range chord, or it can be a blue to a yellow-green modal range chord, or we could just call it by the YI modal range chord as this blue is this shade of blue, or if we labeled each point of the distances, we can label it by blue to yellow-green, right? And then if we add another one, it would be an F major 7. So that still looks like similar to the Ionian. So I'd rather call it a 4-note Lydian chord, or a Lydian for 3 modal whole steps. Dropping the F would be a Lydian 3 modal whole step chord, which has a range of 4 to a 3, which was the Lydian to the Phrygian. We take every other note, which we could call a blue to sky blue chord, or we could call it a 4-3 with this shades of blue, right? This shade of blue, if we have it all in one cell, or a YP modal range chord, or this shades of blue modal range chord, right? So it's all the same from the color standpoint. The color standpoint has to be based on kind of this convention, 4-note Lydian chord, because it's a 4 shade of darkness blue, which is based on the Lydian note. In any case, what if we have an F major 9 chord? So now we have an F major 9. So again, I'd rather call it something around the node, so something like a 5-note Lydian chord, which could then be the blue, which would be the 5 shades of darkness blue chord, right? Or it would be, you could call it a Lydian F4 chord, but the F's redundant, just a Lydian 4 chord. The range then is going to be 4 to 5, or Lydian to mixed Lydian. So you could call the range then the blue magenta modal range chord, or again, just call it the 5 shades of darkness blue chord as the full thing. All right, so then if we do the next one, it would be an F major sharp 11, because that's the one that has the interval difference for the Lydian than the major, so we need an extension to it. But still, I'd rather call it a 6-note Lydian, or 6 shades of blue Lydian chord. 6 shades of blue chord, right? We could just call it 6 shades of blue, the sixth shade of blue chord, and could name it by the blue color. And so it's going to be a Lydian F5 chord, but the F is redundant if we already know it. I'd rather just call it a Lydian 5 modal whole step chord. 5 times 10, 5 times 2 is 10, or the 11th scale degree, which gets us to the Nashville number 7, which is the Locrian note. So it's a Lydian Locrian, or you could call it a blue-yellow modal range chord. All right, and then finally we have the F major 13 sharp 11, which once again needs an extension. I'd rather call it a 7-note Lydian, or the 7th shade of blue chord. And that's going to be, or you can call it a Lydian F6, but the F is redundant, just a Lydian 6 modal whole step. 6 times 2 is 12 modal half steps, which would be the 13th scale degree, getting you to Nashville system number 2, which is the Dorian, which you can call a blue spring green modal range chord. If we look then at distances, looking at distances now, then we say if we go 0 modal half steps up, 1 scale degree up, it would be 0 notes up, which would be flame color. Flame color could be that. The 0 note away perfect first is still flame color. 0 note away from the Lydian node, 0 modal half steps, still flame color. If you go 2 modal half steps up, 3rd scale degree, it's going to be 4 notes up for the Lydian, which is going to be mint color. So you could call that a 4 note away major third, still mint. 4 note away from the Lydian node. 2 modal half steps, still mint color, because the 4 is the thing that's driving the color. That, of course, is the defining distance of a major mode. So we expect it to be the same. If you go 4 modal half steps up, which is the 5th scale degree, we get once again a very stable 7 note distance, which is azure. So you can call it a 7 note away perfect 5th, still azure. 7 note away Lydian 4th modal half step, still azure. If we go 6 modal half steps up, 7th scale degree, it's going to be 11 notes up, which is a major 7, which is only found in 2 out of the 3 major modes and not at all in any of the other modes of the minor or the Locrian, and that's going to be the Ionian and the Lydian. So we're going to give that 11 distance the color of punch. So 11 note away major 7, still punch. 11 note away Lydian's 6th modal half step, still punch color. What if we go 8 notes up, which would be the 9th scale degree? 8 modal half steps up, 9th scale degree would be 2 notes up, or 2 plus 12, but it's going to have a local distance of 2, which has a local color of chartreuse. So you could call that a 2 note away major 2nd, or 2 note away major 9, still chartreuse. 2 note away from the Lydian node, 8 modal half steps, still chartreuse. So if we go 10 modal half steps up, 11th scale degree, it will be 6 notes up. That's the crazy distance. That's the weird one. Right across the clock, 12/6. It's electric sky, because you get electrocuted with that one. So we can call that, now this should be called a 6 note away augmented 4th, or augmented 11th. But because of the formulas, I'm always calling it a diminished 5th, 2 names for the same note, so just be aware of that. And you could call it a 6 note away from the Lydian 10 modal half step. It's still going to be electric sky. If we go 12 modal half steps up, 13th scale degree, it's going to be 9 notes up, or 9 plus 12, but the local distance 9 notes up has a local color of orchid. So a 9 note away major 6, or a 9 note away major 13, orchid. 9 note away Lydian 12 modal half step, orchid color. Okay, so then these are the color systems if we show them by the note colors. So this is not going to be the same as our chord color system, because the chord color system is based on the colors for kind of like the Nashville number system, which is based on C major, right? So if I look at everything from an independent color by note, then those colors will change in a similar fashion as our analogy as the planet moving around, but now we're looking at like the grid as though it's off the planet from space, right? So you could look at it this way, but we can show this then by color system by basically note, but then you have to memorize the colors for which will be different for each collection of 12 collections of 7 notes. Whereas if you remember the relative color system similar to the Nashville number idea, then you'll have the same set of colors for all relative positions for all 12 collections of 7 notes. Now, if we put this into our bucket, then you can see that they match what we have for the Ionian. That's why these are subsumed by these ones up top in our combined table, but then the extensions get pulled out here. So when we put these tables together, what happens? These disappear, get subsumed by these, and then you only see the blue popping out with these extensions because it gets out of whack when you have a different interval from the major scale, which happens to happen on the 11th, which is equivalent to the 4 because it has that augmented 4th, which is the crazy 6 note away distance. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So if we got Mixolydian, so Mixolydian, a G major, looks the same as, I don't know if that G major is Ionian. If I just saw a G major, you don't know if it's Ionian or Lydian or Mixolydian. You would assume one of those 3. It would be nicer to list it by point. I'd rather call it a 3-note Mixolydian, or we know that the Mixolydian node is magenta. So it's the third shades of magenta chord, the 3rd shade of magenta chord, right? We can call it a Mixolydian G2 chord, but the G is redundant if we know the notes. We can call it just a Mixolydian 2 modal whole step chord. If the Mixolydian is the root, you can make the X capital to say this is the tonic. Again, I would rather say the collection of notes is the 7-note collection derived from the C major, and this happens to be then the related mixolydian, but then we're going to focus on the mixolydian as the tonic by possibly capitalizing it here. You could just say, look, we're playing in G mixolydian or whatever you're playing in, that's fine, but like but again, it's making people have to determine the crayon box. They're looking at different shelves to figure out the crayon box, right? When there's really only 12 sets of crayons. So it'd be easier to have a convention that tells you which set of crayons, right? Right. Okay. Anyway, so we can call that a 5-7-2 or a mixolydian Locrian Dorian chord. The endpoints are going to be the 5-2, so you can call it a 5-2 modal range chord, a mixolydian Dorian modal range chord, or by color, you can call it a mixolydian spring green modal range chord. So what if we add another one? This is where the mixolydian gets out of whack because the 7 has a minor 7, so all of the rest of them will be different than the normal major construction. We just could shorten them with a 7. So a G7, or just the letter and the number, but it still has the G. I'd rather drop the G and name it by relative position, calling it a 4-note mixolydian, or just the 4th shade of gray mixolydian chord. I mean, just the 4th shade of gray magenta chord, right? 4th shade of magenta chord. Sorry, 4th shade of magenta chord. That's it. So we could call it a mixolydian G3 modal half-step chord, but the G is redundant. I'd rather just call it a mixolydian 3 modal whole step chord. The 3 times 2 would be 6 modal half steps, which would be the 7th scale degree, resulting in the Nashville number point of 4, which is Lydian, which means you could call it an XY mixolydian Lydian modal range, or a magenta blue modal range chord. So if we add another one, that's just going to be G9, but the G is still not allowing us to transpose it. I'd rather call it a 5-note mixolydian chord, or the 5th shade of magenta chord. 5th shade of magenta chord. We could then just call it a mixolydian G4, but the G is redundant. Just a mixolydian 4, or 4 modal whole step. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 plus 1 gives me the 9th scale degree, which lands us to the endpoint, which is Aeolian. So we could call it a mixolydian Aeolian or magenta Aeolian modal range chord. We then add the G7. The G is redundant. I'd rather call it a 6-note mixolydian, or the 6th shade of magenta mixolydian G5, but the G is redundant. Just a mixolydian 5 modal whole step. 5 times 2 is 10 modal half steps, which is the 11th scale degree, landing us on the 1, which is Ionian from a Nashville number system. So it's a mixolydian Ionian modal range chord, or magenta to yellow-green modal range chord. Finally, we have the G13, which I would like to call the 7-note mixolydian chord, or the 7th shade of magenta chord. Mixolydian G6, the G is redundant though, so just a mixolydian 6 modal whole step, which would be 6 times 2 is 12 modal half steps, 13th scale degree, landing on the Nashville number 3, which is Phrygian. So you can call it a mixolydian Phrygian chord, or a magenta sky blue chord. All right, let's look at distances for the mixolydian. So distances, if we go 0 modal half steps up, 1st scale degree, 0 notes up, we're going to call that flame. Same as we've seen before. Call it a perfect first, call it a 0 note away from the mixolydian, 0 modal half step, still going to be flame. If we go 2 modal half steps up, 3rd scale degree, that's going to be 4 notes up, which we call mint. So you can call it a 4 note away major 3rd, which is the same for all the major modes. 4 note away mixolydian, 2 modal half steps, still mint. So we have then 4 notes away, 4 modal half steps away, 5th scale degree. It's going to be that very solid 7 notes up, which is just azure. 7 note away, perfect first, azure. 7 note away from the mixolydian, 4 modal half steps, azure. If we go 6 notes up, which is the 7th scale degree, we have a difference, a 10. That's where it's different. That's the minor distance, not the major distance. So this time it's going to be 10 is fuchsia. Fuchsia. So we have then a 10 note away minor 7, fuchsia. 10 note away from the mixolydian node, 6 modal half steps, fuchsia. If we go 8 modal half steps up, ninth scale degree, it's going to be 2 notes up, or 2 plus 12. If we take the octave, that's going to be a 2 note away major second, or major 9, it's going to be a chartreuse. Same thing we had before, 2 note away mixolydian, 8 modal half steps chartreuse. 10 notes away, 10 modal half steps up, 11th scale degree, it's going to be a 5 distance up, which is aqua. So we can call that a 5 note away perfect fourth, same as we had before, aqua. 5 note away from the mixolydian, 10 modal half steps aqua. You could also call this a perfect 11. So we have then a 12 modal half steps up, 13th scale degree. It's going to be 9 notes up, same as we had before. Orchid is the color. So it's going to be a 9 note away major 6 or major 16. If we take the octave, it's orchid. It's going to be a 9 note away from the mixolydian, 12 modal half steps orchid. This is going to be the notes. If we look at it from the perspective of the G, this color system will be different from our chord color system, which is based not on note point, but relative position. We could see the major would be consumed up top with the major, and then they had to break out this whole category because it's the 7 that gets messed up, which means that's as soon as we get 4 notes in the chord, it gets messed up, and that's going to mess up all of the rest of them. So we have a whole column for it. Aeolian to the minor modes. So the minor modes are red. So we can say it's going to be an A minor in our case, but the A doesn't tell me, or the A minor doesn't tell me if it's an A, Aeolian, Dorian, or Phrygian. So I'd rather call it something like a 3-note Aeolian, or a the third shade of gray chord. I mean, the third shade of red chord, meaning it's a 3-note red chord, right? Because it's based on the Aeolian. We could call it an Aeolian A2, but the A is redundant. I'd like to drop the A and just call it an Aeolian 2 modal whole step chord. If the Aeolian is the tonic, we can capitalize the A, not to represent it as the note, but the Aeolian node 2 will not get mixed up with the note if we remove all the notes when we write all this down, right? We don't have the notes in there. We have removed them so we can move this up through all collections of notes. Now, again, you'd like to say we're in the collection of notes around C major, and the tonic then is the minor. You could say we're in the collection of notes of A minor, but that's forcing us to have a different formula to figure out the collection of notes. So either way would work. I just think it's nicer to do it the other way as a convention, as is done by the Nashville number system. So that's going to include 613, or the Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian. You could call it an AP modal range chord, or a red to a spring green. Spring green. That's not spring green. A red to a sky blue modal range. What if we have an A minor 7? So the 7s are going to be the same for all of the minors. So that's going to be within all of them. But I'd rather call it, so I don't know which note I'm on, I'd rather call it a 4-note Aeolian chord, or a 4th shade of red chord. 4th shade of red chord. You could call it an Aeolian A 3 modal whole step chord, but the A is redundant if you already know the collection of notes. So you could call it an Aeolian 3 modal whole step. 3 times 2 is 6 modal half steps, which is the 7th scale degree, landing you on the 5 Nashville number system, or the mixolydian, which means you could call it an Aeolian mixolydian modal range chord, or a red magenta modal range chord. Next one, we have an A minor 9. So I'd rather get rid of the A and name it by point, which would be a 5-note Aeolian chord, or the 5th shade of red chord, which you could call an Aeolian A4 modal whole step chord, but the A is redundant if you know the collection of notes. An A4 modal whole step chord, 4 times 2 is 8 modal half steps, which would be the 9th scale degree, which would be the Nashville number 7, or Locrian. So you could call it an Aeolian Locrian chord, or an Aeolian, or a red-yellow modal range chord. So then we have an A minor 11. I'd rather call it a 6-note Aeolian chord, or the 6th shade of red chord, which is an Aeolian, you could call it an Aeolian A5 modal whole step chord, but the A is redundant if you know the collection of notes. Rather call it an Aeolian 5 modal whole step chord. 5 times 2 is 10, which would be the 11th scale degree, which is the 2 Nashville number system, the Dorian. So you could call it an AD modal range chord or a red to the spring green modal range chord. And then finally we have the A minor flat 13, which needs an extension, which is weird, but I'd rather be easier to call it a 7-note Aeolian or the 7th shade of red chord, which would be an Aeolian A6 chord, but the A is redundant. You could just call it an A6 modal whole step chord. 6 times 2 is 12, and 13, therefore, is the scale degree, which gives us 4 as the natural number system, or Lydian. So it'd be an Aeolian Lydian chord or an A or a red-blue chord. Distances for the Aeolian. You get a 0 note away, a 0 modal half step away, first scale degree, which would be 0 notes, flame, perfect first flame, 0 note away from the Aeolian, 0 modal half step, flame. You have then 2 modal half steps up, third scale degree would be 3 notes up, which is going to be lime color. This is different than what we have before, similar color, but different, right? Because it's a half step away, so that's why they're so similar in color, but they're going to be different. So then we have so the 3 is going to 3 note away minor third, and 3 note away from the Aeolian node, second modal half step, both of them lime color as opposed to mint color. Then we have a 4 modal half steps up, 5th scale degree, which is that solid distance again, as we saw all the time before, 7 notes away, solid azure, 7 note away, perfect 5th, azure, 7 note away from the Aeolian node, 4th modal half step, azure. So 6 modal half steps up, 7th scale degree will be 10 notes away, which is the same we had on the mixed Lydian, but different from the Ionian and the Lydian, because that's the minor distance, which is fuchsia. So it's going to be a 10 note away minor 7, fuchsia. 10 note away from the Aeolian node, 6 modal half step, fuchsia. So if we go to the 8th modal half step, which is the 9th scale degree, it would be 2 notes up, or 2 plus 12. That would be a 2 note away major 2nd or major 9, which is going to be chartreuse. 2 note away from the Aeolian node, 8 modal half steps, chartreuse. If we go then 10 modal half steps up, 11 scale degree, 5 notes up, it's going to be aqua. 5 note away, perfect 4th or perfect 11, aqua. 5 note away from the Aeolian node, 10 modal half steps, aqua. 12 modal half steps up, 13th scale degree is going to be 8 notes away, which is grape. 8 is grape. So we're going to have an 8 note away minor 6, grape, or 8 note away minor 6, 13, grape. 8 note away from the Aeolian node, 12 modal half steps, grape. These are the relative colors based on A as the note. And then this is going to be the buckets. So they all fit into this bucket as we would expect, except this one doesn't, which we would not expect. That's weird. Let's keep it rolling because we're running short on time. So Dorian, you would expect it to be much the same. D minor, D minor. D stands for the note here. I'd rather make it based on the modal point. I'd rather call it a 3-note Dorian chord, or you can call it the 3rd shade of spring green, because that's the color. 3rd shade of spring green chord. You could call it a Dorian D2 chord, but the D is redundant if you know the collection of notes. Rather than call it a Dorian 2 modal whole step chord. Remember, and if you're playing in D Dorian, you could emphasize that by capitalizing the D not standing for the note, but the Dorian node, because we removed the notes from our convention so we can easily transpose. But so I'd still rather name the collection of notes based on the relative major, C major collection of notes, but we're on the Dorian node. Or you could just say we're in D Dorian, and then you have to figure it out from the Dorian. But I don't think that should be the normal convention most of the time, because it's nicer not to say it by the one convention. You'd be a 2, 4, 6 from the modal points. So that would be a Dorian Aeolian or a spring green Aeolian spring green red modal range chord. Then you can have a D minor 7. I'd rather call it a 4-note away, 4-note Dorian chord, or the 4th shade of spring green chord. Could call it a Dorian D3 chord, but the D is redundant if you know the collection of notes. Could call it then just a Dorian 3 modal whole step chord, or 3 times 2 is 6 modal half steps, 7th scale degree. 1 would be the natural number point, which is the Aeolian Dorian Ionian. So that would be a spring green to yellow green modal range chord. Then we have a D minor 9. that I'd rather call a 5-note Dorian, or the 5th shade of spring green chord. Could call it a D4 chord, but the second D is redundant. If you know the collection of notes, rather call it a D4 modal whole step chord. 4 times 2 is 8 modal half steps, plus 1 is 9 scale degree, which would give us 3 from a Nashville number system, which is the P for Phrygian, spring green to sky blue modal range chord. Then we have the D minor 11, which I'd rather call a 6-note Dorian chord, or the 6th shade of spring green chord, which could call it a D5 chord, but the D is redundant. I'd rather call it a D5 modal whole step chord. 5 times 2 is 10 modal half steps, plus 1 is the 11th scale degree, which would give us the 5 as the Nashville number system, which is Mixolydian, which would be then a spring green to magenta modal range chord. D minor 13. I'd rather call it a 7-note Dorian chord, 7th shade of spring green chord, which you call a Dorian D6 modal whole step chord, but the D is redundant, just a Dorian 6 modal whole step chord. 6 times 2 is 12 modal half steps, plus 1 13 scale degree, gives us the point Nashville number system 7, which is Locrian or yellow. All right, let's look at then the distances. So if we go 0 notes up, that's going to be, once again, flame. That's the same. Let's go through this faster and just note the difference. So if we go 3 notes up, that's going to be, once again, the minor third. That would be the same, and that's going to be lime color. 7 notes up, that's that solid distance of the perfect fifth, which is going to be azure. If we go 10 up, all of the minors are going to have that 10 distance, which is fuchsia, 10 note away, minor 7, 10 note away from the Dorian, 6 modal half step. And then we have the same for the 2, which is the 2 note away major second, and that's chartreuse. Once again, same for the aqua. We have the same distance, 5 note away perfect fourth. And then we have then a 9 note away versus the 8 last time. This is where the distance is at. So we have a 9 note away major 6, which is going to be orchid, or 9 note away major 13, note away from the Dorian 12th modal half step. These are going to be the notes from the perspective of the D Dorian. Notice the Dorian fits entirely in the minor section. So that means it's going to be consumed entirely by the Aeolian when we combine them, except that last one will pop out because the Aeolian needed an extension for that last one. Okay, and then we go to the next one, and we say Phrygian. So we have an F minor. So I'd rather call it a 3-note Phrygian, noting that the Phrygian is sky blue. So I'd rather call it a 3rd shade of sky blue chord from a color standpoint. You could call it a Phrygian F2 chord, but the F is redundant. If you know the collection of notes, I'd rather just call it a Phrygian 2 modal whole step chord, or if it's the tonic, a capital Phrygian 2 modal whole step chord. Remembering, I'd rather name the collection of notes as from the perspective of the major. It's in the C major collection of notes, but the tonic is going to be indicated by the Phrygian if I capitalize it here, or you could just say that we're in the F Phrygian chord, but it's a little bit harder, but I don't think that's where we went over that. So I could say that's going to be a 3, 5, 7 modal range chord, which is going to be a sky blue, magenta, yellow modal range chord. So then the next one is an F minor 7. I'd rather call it a 4-note Phrygian, chord, or a 4th shade of sky blue chord, or a Phrygian F3 chord, but the F is redundant, so I'd rather call it an F3 modal whole step chord. 3 times 2 is 6 modal half steps, 7 scale degree, which would give us the 2 Nashville number system, which is the Dorian, which would be sky blue, spring green chord. Next is an F minor extension, flat 9, because that's where the difference is. It's going to mess up all the rest of them. And I'd rather call it a 5-note Phrygian chord, or a 5th shade of spring green, 5th shade of sky blue chord, or a Phrygian F 4th modal whole step chord, but The F is redundant, so just a Phrygian 4 modal whole step. 4 times 2 is 8 modal half steps. 9 scale degree, Nashville number system 4, which is a Lydian sky blue to blue modal range chord. So then the next one is going to be an F minor 11 flat 9. So that flat 9 is going to follow through, make an extension, messing up the rest of them, which I'd rather call a 6-note Phrygian chord, or the 6th shade of sky blue chord, a Phrygian F5 modal whole step chord. F is redundant. Phrygian 5 modal whole step chord. 5 times 2 is 10. And then 10 plus 1 is 11 for the scale degree. 6 Nashville number system. A, you can call it then a sky blue to red modal range chord. Then you have the Phrygian, the F minor flat 13 flat 9 chord, 2 extensions. I'd rather just call it a 7-note Phrygian chord, or a 7th shade of sky blue chord, which would be a Phrygian F6 modal whole step chord. F's redundant. Phrygian 6 modal whole steps. 6 times 2 is 12 modal whole steps. 13th scale degree, Nashville number system 1 node Ionian range, sky blue, yellow green range. Let's look at the distances, trying to focus on just the differences here. So we have the same intervals for the what do we call this, flame color, and then the same interval for the minor third, which is lime. We've got the 7 is still azure. We got the 10 note away minor 7 is still going to be fuchsia. We've got now, however, the 1-note distance. This is where this one is different than both the Aeolian and the Dorian. This this right. So that's going to be then. This one is going to be then 1 note away, which is going to be amber. 1 note away minor second or minor 9 is going to be amber. 1 note away from the Phrygian 8 modal half steps is going to be amber. Then we have the same distance here, which was aqua, and then the same distance for the 8, and H8 is grape. All right, this is going to be then our colors by notes, and then here's going to be where it fits in our chart. These two will be consumed by the other main minor, Aeolian minor scale, and these are the extensions that will pop up if I combine these charts together. Finally, we have Locrian. So it's kind of like the minor, but then it has the flat 5. So we call that a 3-note chord, would be a B diminished, but I'd rather not have the B there, even though the diminished would pretty much tell me usually that that's the Locrian node, but I'd rather just call it a 3-note Locrian, or the 3rd shade of yellow chord, or a Locrian B2 chord, but the B is redundant. I'd rather just call it a Locrian 2 modal whole step chord. And if it was the tonic, which it usually isn't, you can capitalize the Locrian. So it would be a capital Locrian 2 modal whole step chord. 2 times 2 is 4 modal half steps, which would be the 5th scale degree, landing on Nashville number system 4, which is Lydian yellow to blue modal range chord. Next, we have a B half diminished 7. All the rest will just simply be half diminished, similar to what we saw with the Mixolydian having its own category. I'd rather call it a 4-note Locrian chord, or the 4th shade of yellow chord. It would be a Locrian B3, but the B is redundant if we know the collection of notes. Just a Locrian 3 modal whole step chord. 3 times 2 is 6. 7th scale degree, therefore. 6 is the Nashville number. That would be an A or Aeolian, and so that would be a yellow-red modal range chord. Then we have a B half diminished 9, which I'd rather call a 5-note Locrian chord, or the 5th shade of yellow chord, which could be called a Locrian B4, but the B is redundant. I'd rather just call it a Locrian 4th modal whole step chord. 4 times 2 is 8. 9th scale degree gives us 1 Nashville number system, which is the Ionian, so it could be a yellow to a yellow-green chord. Then we have a B half diminished. This should be an 11. That's a typo. 11 chord. I'd rather call it a 6-note Locrian chord, or 6th shade of yellow chord. A Locrian B5 modal whole step chord. B is redundant, just a Locrian 5 modal whole step. 5 times 2 is 10. And that would be 11 scale degrees, given Nashville number system 3, which is a Phrygian, which could be a yellow to a sky blue chord. So then we could then have finally a B half diminished 13, which I'd rather call a 7-note Locrian chord, or the 7th degree of yellow chord, which can be a Locrian B6 chord. B is redundant. I'd rather call it just a Locrian 6 modal whole step chord. 6 times 2 is 12, and plus 1 would be 13 scale degree. 5 Nashville number system, which gives us the Mixolydian, so it'd be a Locrian Mixolydian chord or a yellow to magenta chord. Let's just look at the differences for the distances for the Locrian. We have the same distance of 0 starting out, which is the perfect first. That's going to be the flame color. Same 3, which is the minor third. That's going to be the lime color. But this time we have a 6. That's the crazy one. That's the crazy, we call it the electric sky, because you get electrocuted. So that's going to be 4 modal half steps up, or the 5th scale degree, which is going to be a 6 note away diminished or flat 5. And then we could call it a 6 note away from the Locrian node, 4th modal half step, all electric sky color. Then we get back to the norm for the minors, a 10 note away, 6 modal half step or 7th scale degree, which is fuchsia, 10 note away minor 7, 10 note away from the Locrian node, 6 modal half step. And then we have that weird one again. We saw it before, but it's still odd because it's only there for 1 out of the 3 minors. That's why the Locrian is kind of closer to the Phrygian node than the Aeolian node, and the Dorian node is closer to the majors. So the Locrian has then, for the 8 modal half step, 9th scale degree, it has a 1 note away, which is going to be amber, or 1 plus 12 if we take the octave. So it would be a 1 note away major 2 or major 9, which is amber, 1 note away from the Locrian node, 8 modal half step, amber. And then we're back to the norm with a 5 distance, which is a 5 note away perfect 4th, which is going to be aqua. And then the norm for a minor mode, an 8 note away, which is going to be an 8 note away minor 6. 8 is grape. So 8 note away from the Locrian node, 12 modal half steps. And this is going to be then the notes. And then it gets its own 2 categories or buckets that it dominates on its own, because he had to make them because it's so crazy that we had to put it in its own bucket so it doesn't mess up any of the other ones, because the intervals are all different. So if you combine those together, this chart will give you the better kind of convention. So you can see this is where the Ionians fall. This is where the Lydians compared to the Ionians. These get consumed by the Ionians. Mixolydian to the Ionian. This gets consumed by the Ionian. Then the Aeolian falls here, but this one gets messed up. So then the Dorian, you're not going to see any of it when we combine it except for that one. Then the Phrygian, these two are going to be consumed by the Aeolian. These extensions will then be shown. And then the Dorian has its 2 columns all to itself because it's so crazy no one else wants to be around them. So then if we go here, that's what we see, right? The majors dominate the entire column. The other 2 major modes, you have the Mixolydian is consumed here, but then it breaks out because the 7 is where it gets messed up. And then the major extension over here with the Lydian gets consumed for these 3, but the 11 extension messes it up, which is equivalent to the 4. That's the augmented 4 that messes it up. Then the minors are here. Doesn't take the entire column, though. It has an extension that needed to be popped out here. The other 2 minor modes in comparison to it then will be the Dorian, which actually does fit entirely here. But then this one is the Dorian color, which took the place of the extended Aeolian that had to move out here. And then the other minor is going to be the Phrygian, which is consumed by these 2 of the minor, but then it had to pop out because it needed an extension on the 9, which is equivalent to the 2, the minor second, and then that messed it up all the way down for the 5-note chord, the 6, and the 7-note chord.